EQ Video Tip. I'm your host, Eric Forsetter, and as always, it's great to have you back for another great edition of this week's tip. Before we get started, let's review the goals of EQ Video Tip. What's on tap this week? Well, we have a great double feature, and it comes to us from Taryn McKenzie, who's the EVP of Client Solutions for Talent EQ. And let's brace for it. Feedback is coming. Ooh, it's a tough thing to hear. How do we give good feedback, and more importantly, how do we receive it? Because when we receive feedback, our first inclination is we get tense, we get nervous, we want to respond, we want to have that difficult conversation, but we also want to retaliate sometimes. And instead of doing that, Taryn's going to give us some tips on how to receive feedback this week, and in the next episode, we'll go into how to give good feedback. Let's jump into some of the tips. Tip number one, and it's actually trap number one, not fully listening. Make sure that you're fully listening to the person that's talking to you. It may seem threatening, it may have an adrenaline spike as soon as you hear we have to have that talk, but you want to make sure your fight or flight mentality doesn't kick in. Instead, take a break, take a breath, I should say. Make sure you think for a second and tell yourself it's time to pause and listen. It's the first step in EQ, or emotional intelligence, pausing and listening. Sit back, absorb it all. Now, that may be hard to do because it's going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be some things that might be triggering. But at the end, you can say something like, wow, this is a lot to absorb. Let me sit down and make sure I really hear and know what you're saying. In that regard, you'll get a chance to absorb the feedback and then be able to sort through it without that fight or flight syndrome kicking in. Tip or trap, I should say, number two, getting stuck in your own perceptions about yourself or misperceptions. You may think that you're one thing and perceive yourself one way, but we all have this perception of ourselves that allows us to operate in the world around us and go through our guiding principles as well as our guiding norms on a day-to-day basis. That said, if someone tells you something else, you'll say, wait a second, I thought people viewed me this way when in fact they're viewing me a completely opposite. How could this person tell me that that's not the case? So it's an opportunity for you to look at yourself, have self-awareness, self-management, and acknowledge the person's other perspective, because maybe there are people who view you in this other light. When this happens, instead of saying, wait, I thought people viewed me this way, say, I never saw it this way. Now, I can see it from that perspective, and this is something I can try to manage hopefully for the next time. Take a pause, think about it, and try to understand, have some empathy, and understand what's going on from another person's perspective in terms of how they perceive you. Tip number three, our last tip, or trap number three, assuming negative intent. While it may seem that that person sitting across from you right now, giving you that perspective that you don't want to hear, is your enemy, if you're in a work setting, you probably have similar goals, you probably have similar aspirations, and hopefully your company is aligned so you have a similar mission. And that's really important, that you're focusing on differences of opinion and perspective, and assume that the person has the best intent for you as well as for the company as well. And when they do that, instead of assuming that they're out to get you some kind of hidden agenda, assume that they're trying to break down some diverse barriers that are between you and ensure a better company and a better you as well. So instead of saying, hey, I want to retaliate or do something that you really shouldn't do, try this instead. While it sounds like you might be criticizing my work, I think that you have the ultimate team goal in mind and the team's best intention. So how can we best work together to ensure that we accomplish our mutual goals? Remember, be a Q-tip. Quit taking it personally and try to give the person the benefit of the doubt, as they don't necessarily have negative intent. That concludes this week's EQ video tip. Hopefully you enjoyed these great tips on how to receive feedback. Next week we'll come back with more on how to actually give the feedback as well. Thanks again, and Make these tips yours. So that concludes our EQ video tip for today. Try incorporating some of these tips into your daily routine. But remember, use what works best for you and personalize it for yourself. Thank you always to our great research team for providing us with some great tips today. As always on EQ Video Tip, we want to end with gratitude. So thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. Here are some resources that you can use if you want more information on EQ going forward. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you.